flatten something you intended to preserve. The silence spreading from our table was audible. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone set a fork down too carefully. The room held its breath. I looked at the man I'd built a life with and said the only thing that felt true. Then make sure you can afford the upgrade. Tyler laughed. He actually laughed, low and pleased with himself, like I'd handed him exactly the reaction he'd hoped for. The wounded wife, swallowing her pride, letting him walk out the door with his dignity intact while hers scattered across the ballroom floor like confetti nobody wanted. He turned and left with KH Low on his arm. I watched them cross the ballroom past people who'd known me for 15 years, past the infrastructure of respect I'd spent years building, while Tyler convinced himself he'd built his success alone. I finished the evening. I said goodbye to the last guest. I thanked the hotel staff. I reviewed the closing numbers to ensure everything had gone according to plan. Then I climbed the stairs to the small office suite I maintained for events and sat down at my desk in my heels, holding that $100 bill like it might reveal something if I studied it long enough. My phone lit up with a message from Martin Cole, the forensic auditor the board had quietly brought in 3 weeks earlier to review suspicious vendor payments connected to Tyler's consulting contract. We found the missing payments. Your husband authorized every single one. I set the phone down next to the bill. For a long moment, I sat in the quiet, listening to the hotel's ventilation system hum, feeling something in my chest settle rather than break. Tyler believed he'd ended our marriage that night. What he'd actually done was remove the last remaining obstacle to the truth. 18 years of marriage don't replay in chronological order when they're ending. Memory works differently, fragmentary, selective. You get glimpses. The apartment we couldn't afford in our 20s. The folding table we used as a makeshift desk before Tyler had an office. The way he used to call me at midnight, breathless with ideas, as if I was the only person whose opinion could make them real. I was the architect of his early success. I introduced him to 3 of his first 5 clients. I covered our mortgage for 2 consecutive years, while Murphy Strategic Logistics was hemorrhaging money, and I never once mentioned it at dinner parties because I understood, even then, that Tyler needed to believe his success was entirely his own, untainted by my support. I called it generosity at the time. Looking back, I recognize it as something closer to careful management, soothing his ego so the machinery of our marriage could keep functioning. Somewhere along the way, without me noticing the transition, the narrative shifted. Tyler stopped saying, "We built this," and started saying, "I built this." He'd tell new acquaintances that he'd clawed his way up from nothing, that I was fortunate to have landed somewhere stable. I let it go because correcting him in public felt petty, and because some tired part of me had begun believing that maintaining peace was worth more than maintaining accuracy. The signs had been present for months before the gala. In spring, Tyler changed his phone's passcode and made a joke of it when I noticed. "Just tightening security," he said. Money moved out of our joint account in amounts that matched nothing we discussed. Business trips included hotel charges that traced back to addresses 20 minutes from our house. His company's invoices to Northbridge climbed quarter after quarter. New vendors appeared on the books with addresses that made our finance team's spreadsheets flag red. I need to be precise about something. I didn't dig into these discrepancies out of jealousy. Numbers were always my language, my first language, before Tyler was even in my vocabulary. The numbers didn't add up, and when numbers are your job, when mathematics is how you understand the world, you notice. When our finance department flagged unsupported charges tied to his contract, I removed myself from the entire review. I wasn't going to audit my own husband. That would corrupt the investigation. The board brought in Martin Cole, independent, unaffiliated, the kind of man who builds cases from documents instead of instinct or hope. Martin had sent me a preliminary summary a week before the gala. I hadn't opened it. Some stubborn, hopeful part of me was waiting for Tyler to come home, sit down at our kitchen table, and tell me the truth himself. I was waiting for him to give me a reason not to need that file. He gave me a different reason instead. That night, still wearing my dress, I finally opened the document I'd been avoiding. 20 minutes was all it took to understand the architecture of his deception. Tyler had created a shell company called Bennett Vendor Solutions, registered under K.H. Lowe's brother's name, North. Ridge had paid nearly $480,000 for services that were either grossly inflated or never actually rendered. A significant portion of that money had funneled directly into the account that paid rent on K.H. Lowe's apartment, the Riverview one I'd never been invited to see. The apartment that had been paid for by my employer, by my reputation, by the trust people placed in my judgment. But the detail that changed something fundamental in me was buried in a stack of authorization forms. My signature, copied onto documents I'd never seen, never signed, never authorized. The affair was his to carry. I might have eventually found a way to navigate that betrayal. But he hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd made me an unwitting accomplice to fraud. He'd used the name I'd spent 20 years building a reputation around to shield criminal activity. He'd weaponized my credibility. I called Evelyn Grant, Northbridge's general counsel, and the kind of friend who'd never asked me to perform emotions for her comfort. "Remove me from every document he used my name on," I said. My voice came out steadier than seemed possible. "Preserve the evidence. Follow the law." She didn't ask if I was sure. Evelyn understood the architecture of what he'd done. "What about the marriage?" she asked, not unkindly. I took the $100 bill out of my coat and smoothed it flat one more time. "That decision was made for me tonight." Then Evelyn told me something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. The board had already scheduled Tyler for the next morning at 8:00 a.m., a routine conversation about contract renewal. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Tyler showed up the next morning in a dark suit he reserved for closing meetings, the kind of suit that whispered expectations of walking out with a signed contract. He'd spent the night with K.H. Lowe, calling me 4 times between midnight and 7:00 a.m., each call sliding to voicemail while I watched the phone light up on the kitchen counter, drinking coffee that tasted like nothing. He still believed the gala had gone in his favor. K.H. Lowe had told him he'd looked powerful, decisive, like a man who didn't apologize for wanting more. He assumed I'd spend a few days sulking and then come around the way I always had, smoothing everything over so our household could function again. He had no idea that coming around was no longer a behavior available to me. At the front desk, he asked for my office. My assistant redirected him to conference room 4 with polite professionalism. He didn't question it. He thought it was the standard vendor meeting, probably texting K.H. Lowe from the elevator about getting the renewal signed before lunch. When the door opened, he found something entirely different waiting. I was seated at the head of the table. Evelyn sat to my right. Martin Cole had 3 thick folders arranged in front of him. Nathan Brooks and 2 board members occupied one side. Northbridge's outside counsel sat near the door, positioned to ensure no one could simply walk out. A screen displayed a flowchart of payments, arrows tracing money through a maze of accounts. And on the table in front of me, smoothed flat, sat the $100 bill. Tyler's face changed the moment he understood the room. Not fear exactly, but something closer to disbelief. The look of someone whose calculations were suddenly invalidated. "What is this?" he asked. "The part of the evening you didn't stay long enough to see," I said. Nathan opened the meeting with formal precision, explaining that this was an investigative session regarding irregularities in Tyler's consulting contract. Martin walked through the findings methodically. No theater, just facts. Duplicate invoices. Freight charges for shipments that never existed. A vendor entity tracing back to K.H. Lowe's brother. A payment stream feeding her apartment lease. A signature that wasn't mine. Tyler turned to me, with something desperate entering his voice. "You had me investigated." "The company investigated its money," I said. "You were simply where the money led." He tried briefly to reframe the entire room as personal retaliation, insisting I was punishing him for leaving with another woman. I didn't argue. I nodded to Martin, who played a recording pulled from the company's vendor line, Tyler's voice unmistakable, instructing an accountant to change invoice descriptions so they'd clear review without questions. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the gala. That one had been shock. This was verdict. When Tyler finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge. You're going to destroy me, he said quietly, almost to himself. I looked at the $100 bill on the table between us. No, Tyler, I said. I stopped protecting you. Nathan closed the meeting with practical consequences delivered without cruelty but without softening. The contract was suspended effective immediately. All outstanding payments were frozen pending review. The file would be forwarded to legal authorities if Tyler refused full cooperation with the audit. He didn't argue. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed unable to talk his way into a better version of the room. As he stood to leave, he looked back at me once, and I saw something underneath the anger. Something closer to the man I'd married before success rearranged his entire architecture. I didn't reach for that man. A week later, the board scheduled a vote on the contract's fate. It was in that room that a version of my history finally surfaced, one Tyler had never fully understood, because I'd spent years making myself smaller so he wouldn't feel diminished beside me. 12 years earlier, Northbridge had nearly collapsed under a product recall that threatened to destroy the entire company. I was director of operations then, still years away from my current position. I traced the failure back through the supply chain. I renegotiated 3 vendor contracts that everyone said were unbreakable. I kept more than 600 people employed through a quarter that could have ended in mass layoffs. When the company needed capital to stabilize, I invested my own savings. That small stake had grown over a decade into 14% ownership, a board seat, and voting weight that mattered. I'd never advertised any of this to Tyler. Early in our marriage, he'd once said, only half joking, that he never wanted to feel like he was living in my shadow, so I'd made myself smaller. I kept my name out of trade publications. I avoided board photographs when possible. I let him introduce himself to clients as though he'd built his network entirely alone. Nathan said it plainly in front of Tyler, in a tone that wasn't cruel but didn't soften the truth. Your company received that contract because Danielle vouched for your integrity. I watched something land on Tyler's face that hit harder than anything Martin's documents had shown him. Not the loss of money, but the loss of the thing he'd built his entire identity around. He hadn't earned his way into that room alone. I had opened the door and stepped back so he could believe he'd opened it himself. The board voted unanimously. The contract was terminated. The upgrade. By afternoon, Tyler had called K.H. Lowe repeatedly. She didn't pick up. By evening, he discovered that his business line of credit was under review. 3 other clients had called with pointed questions. The story was moving through Chicago's business circles, quietly at first, then all at once. K.H. Lowe left him when she realized he'd used her brother's name without asking what it might cost him. K.H. Lowe was gone, and with her went the fantasy of the upgrade he'd been so certain he was making. For me, the weeks that followed felt less like victory and more like excavation, clearing away the parts of my life that had been constructed around making myself convenient for someone else's comfort. I repainted the bedroom, a color Tyler had always vetoed. I hung photographs he'd considered clashing with the furniture. Small things, but small things done entirely for yourself accumulate into something that feels like solid ground. Nathan asked if I'd consider stepping into a newly created Chief Strategy Officer role, formalizing the influence I'd been quietly carrying for a decade. I said yes without hesitation. In early December, Tyler texted asking if we could talk, just 2 people who'd once loved each other. I agreed to one conversation in daylight, in a public place, with nothing left to prove. He looked smaller across that table than in 18 years, though not physically. Something quieter had diminished him. His apology actually sounded like an apology rather than a negotiation. He didn't ask me to reconsider the marriage. Instead, he asked something harder, whether he could rebuild something honest somewhere else, with someone else, without repeating the same pattern. I don't know, I told him honestly, but it won't start with borrowing someone else's name to make yours look bigger. He nodded. For a moment, I saw the boy from that first apartment again, the one who called me at midnight with ideas, before he learned to call them his alone. I didn't reach for that boy. I let him remain what he'd become, a memory rather than an invitation. Walking out into the December air, I took the $100 bill from my pocket. I'd carried it for 2 months through every meeting, every signature, every decision that rebuilt my footing. I looked at it under the streetlight, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope addressed to the Domestic Violence and Financial Abuse Support Fund the company had sponsored for years. Some symbols need to be spent on something other than the moment that created them. The divorce was finalized quietly. Everything divided the way two reasonable adults divide a shared life when one of them has stopped fighting for the marriage and started fighting for truth instead. Northbridge closed its pension deal in March. The board formalized my Chief Strategy Officer title that same month. I didn't measure my success against the wreckage of Tyler's life. That never occurred to me. Sophie and I found our footing on new ground. She saw her father on her own terms, at a pace she controlled. She told me once that watching how I carried myself afterward had explained everything better than words could have. Tyler, by all accounts, was rebuilding something smaller and more honest. He'd taken on modest clients, nothing near the scale of Northbridge. From what Sophie mentioned in passing, he seemed to be doing the work himself now instead of borrowing someone else's credibility. In April, an envelope arrived at my office with no return address, just my name and handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside was a $100 bill and 4 lines of careful script. "You were right, I never understood what anything cost. I'm trying to learn now. I hope that means something even if it doesn't change anything between us." I sat with it at my desk, turning the bill over carefully. It wasn't the same one I'd carried out of that ballroom. That one had been folded into an envelope for people rebuilding after exactly the kind of financial harm Tyler had caused. This was new, offered without conditions, a small act of accounting from someone finally trying to settle a debt that had never been about money. That evening, I called Sophie and asked if she wanted dinner at the Italian place near our old house, the one Tyler decided wasn't sophisticated enough for his new self-image. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We sat at a corner table with a wobble we used to joke about and talked about everything that mattered. Her thesis, a boy she wasn't sure about, whether I was sleeping enough. When the check came, I set Tyler's $100 bill on top of it. Sophie recognized it immediately. "Is that the one Dad sent?" "Yes." "Why spend it? You could have kept it, framed it even, proof of everything." I watched the candlelight catch the edge of the bill. "Because I don't need to carry his insult to remember my worth," I told her. "I already know what I'm worth. I don't need a piece of paper to hold that memory for me." We left change along with a larger tip for the woman working the late shift. Tired-looking, kind, the type of woman who reminded me of myself 20 years earlier, before I understood how much of my own value I had to reclaim one decision at a time. Sophie's arm looped through mine as we walked into the cool April evening. I drove home to a house that finally felt entirely my own. No one was waiting there. And for the first time in a long while, that didn't feel like an absence. It felt like room to breathe. What would you have done in that ballroom? Confronted him immediately or waited for the truth to do its work? I'm curious where you're watching from and how you might have handled it differently. There are countless more stories like this waiting for you, stories about reclaiming power, about choosing yourself, about the quiet dignity of standing in your own truth. If this one moved something in you, subscribe and stay close. I don't want you to miss what comes next.